Robb Stark stood atop the ancient battlements of Moat Cailin, the bitter wind biting at his face. Despite the chill, his gaze never wavered from the marshland horizon, where distant lines of men trudged forward. They were his own soldiers, the loyal Northmen who had followed him south in his initial campaign against the Iron Throne. Now they returned at his command. He felt the cold coil of regret in his chest as he thought of all the men who would never return from the battles waged in the Riverlands. Yet here he stood, king in the north, recalling the fierce conviction that had taken hold of him when he first raised his sword in defiance of House Lannister. Once, he had marched with a singular purpose: to avenge his father, Ned Stark, to rescue his sisters, and to break the hold of the Iron Throne upon the north. Over time, the wearying months of warfare and the swirl of betrayals had corroded that straightforward mission. But a letter he had received just a fortnight ago sparked something new in him, a flicker of hope and of challenge. Jon Snow had sent word from the Wall. At first, Robb had barely believed that the letter was genuine. His half-brother, or so he had always thought him, had sounded grave in his short, pragmatic sentences. In that letter, Jon had requested an urgent meeting in Winterfell. A leaving of the Night's Watch, it seemed, or at least an extended departure. A cause so dire that only the combined might of the Stark bloodline could see it through. The letter had been sealed with the black wax of the Watch, and the sworn brother who had carried it that far simply vanished after delivering it. Yet there had been no threat in Jon's words, only a quiet desperation and hints of wonders that stung Robb's heart with an odd mixture of fear and possibility. Robb breathed in the swampy air, remembering the nights he'd spent in the damp towers, coughing from the moldy scents that lingered in corners. He was eager to return to Winterfell, if only for a while. Where once he had worried that such a move might appear cowardly, or an abandonment of his allies in the south, the war had changed shape. With the Lannisters overextended in the Crownlands, and their hold on the kingdoms tenuous at best, there was a new window of opportunity. More importantly, the North's spirit remained unbroken. His bannermen were weary but would rally again if he could provide them a strong reason, something to ignite their loyalty as Ned Stark once had. Jon's letter promised something that could unify the North like never before, though it spoke in cryptic phrases. "I have found a secret beneath Winterfell. It changes everything." Those were the words that kept Robb from resting. The night he'd received them, he barely slept, pacing in the flickering candlelight while Grey Wind, his direwolf, whined at his side. He needed to see what Jon had discovered. The earliest news from the Wall suggested that the wildlings had been allowed south, that the White Walkers were more than an old wives' tale. Reports from scattered survivors had begun to filter down, describing whites in the far north, undead nightmares that made the Lannister menace pale by comparison. The realm might soon have bigger concerns than who wore the crown. But the portion of the letter that had caught Robb's attention most was talk of something that once belonged to the Targaryens. The idea that something so significant could be hidden beneath the seat of House Stark confounded him. Could Winterfell, his childhood home, truly harbor a relic of dragons? Winterfell was ancient. His father had once told him that the castle had been built on hot springs that kept the halls warm during the cruelest of winters. He remembered as a child wandering half-secret passages to dip his hands into the steaming water. And while the crypts below were rumored to stretch deeper than any living man could guess, so long had House Stark endured that the truth of what lay in the lowest depths had been largely lost to memory, overshadowed by myths of Brandon the Builder and the old kings who had once ruled an independent kingdom. Perhaps some part of that ancient bloodline still thrived, or some relic had been locked away in darkness. He intended to find out. Turning from the battlements, Robb waved for his captains to gather. He made a quick decision to leave a small garrison in Moat Cailin, just enough to hold the key fortress from any southern advancement while his main force headed to Winterfell. His mother, Catelyn Stark, would ride beside him, ever watchful and keen. While she had once opposed certain moves of the war, she now seemed resolute that the only path forward was to trust in family. With his men forming columns behind him, Robb felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had never felt quite so determined to see his brother. A new page of their shared saga was about to turn. They reached Winterfell just before dusk 5 days later. The old gray walls welcomed Robb like the arms of a silent guardian. He had left Winterfell in haste, chasing battles and crowns, never anticipating that so much time would pass before he returned. The gate swung open and a hush fell upon his men. Even the horses stamping on the courtyard's cobblestones felt the tension in the air. The direwolf banners that lined the ramparts snapped in the wind, a reminder that House Stark, battered though it might be, was unbroken. One figure emerged from the keep's main entrance, cloaked in black, though hardly a typical Night's Watch ranger anymore. Jon Snow had arrived hours earlier, and when he lifted his gaze to meet Robb's, a flicker of something unspoken passed between them. Jon approached, discarding formalities. They clasped hands, and Robb pulled him into a fierce embrace. For a moment, no words were spoken, only the warmth of family that had been denied them both for too long. When they parted, Robb noticed the weariness etched into Jon's face. New lines around his eyes, a faint sadness in his posture. The responsibilities of the wall weighed heavily on him, but also something else, something brimming behind his dark eyes. They shared a muted exchange of greetings with Caitlin, whose features were tight with concern. She regarded Jon with a mother's scrutiny, though the old distance that had once existed between them now seemed tempered by sorrow and time. Together, they entered the great hall, where torches were lit against the early evening gloom, and the stone floor bore the scuff marks of recent gatherings. Servants hurried to bring warm drinks and plates of bread and roasted game. The small retinue of lords who still held Winterfell after the Ironborn occupation joined them at the dais. Yet before any official talk or celebratory feast could begin, Jon asked for a moment with Robb alone. They found privacy in Ned Stark's solar, a circular room whose stone walls were lined with shelves of old books and ledgers. The hearth glowed with a steady fire, illuminating the Stark sigil etched above the mantel. Robb observed the room with a swelling sense of memory. This was where his father had once taught him the duties of a northern lord. Now he felt Ned's absence keenly, as if the shadows themselves mourned the passing of the man who had so often stood here, hands clasped behind his back, patient and wise. Jon, too, seemed affected. His gaze touched upon every corner, as though reacquainting himself with a place from childhood dreams. Robb leaned forward, resting his palms on the table. "Your letter was urgent. Show me what you have found," he said. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of command and longing. Jon placed a small leather pouch upon the table and unrolled its contents. What spilled into the flickering firelight was not the thing itself but a curious medallion. It bore the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Robb felt his heart stutter. Hadn't he heard tales that the Targaryen monarchy once reigned with actual dragons at their command? That ancient line had been nearly extinguished during Robert's rebellion, leaving only Viserys and Daenerys, or so the stories said. But seeing the Targaryen sigil in such a stark, tangible form made the legends feel disturbingly real. Jon exhaled, as if uncertain how to proceed. The old stories speak of dragon eggs that were turned to stone. Some were lost, some destroyed. Daenerys Targaryen hatched 3 across the sea, so the rumors go. I never put stock in such tales. Not until I discovered something in the crypts below. Robb could feel his pulse quicken. In the Winterfell crypts? A labyrinth. Really? Jon replied, pushing hair from his forehead in a gesture of weariness. Beyond the tombs we know, beyond the statues of Stark lords, there's more. Old tunnels and sealed vaults that no living Stark has entered in centuries, if not longer. The vault was hidden behind a collapsed wall. I found it after chasing a rumor from one of the Night's Watch builders. He told me the foundations of Winterfell contained hidden pockets of space. I explored it by torchlight, crawling through rubble. And what I found, Robb, was an egg. Stone-like, yet it's warm to the touch. I couldn't lift it without feeling something alive inside. Robb's thoughts whirled. You're saying a dragon egg is beneath our home? How is that possible? The Starks have no ties to House Targaryen. Jon's expression hardened, uncertain. No one knows everything about the old times. Perhaps there were alliances we never heard of, or spoils of war stored in secret. Or maybe it was hidden here long after the Targaryens conquered Westeros, to be kept safe far from suspicious eyes. All I know is that it's real. I placed it back where I found it, for it felt dangerous to move. I worry if the heat continues to grow, it might hatch. And that's not all. Robb felt the air grow still, the crackle of flames behind him, an almost living presence. Go on. Jon's jaw set. There's a second chamber, a room where old bones rest. I believe they might be dragon bones. In truth, I only saw glimpses in the dark, but they were far larger than any beast I know. This changes everything, Robb. Dragons could be returning to the world and not just across the sea. The White Walkers are real. I've seen them with my own eyes, and the realm is threatened as never before. If we could command a dragon, the possibility made Robb's head swim. The wars he had fought so far had all been conventional, men with swords, the occasional siege engine, alliances, and betrayals. A dragon was a monstrous power that could upend every careful strategy. And with the Lannisters seated precariously in King's Landing, with the realm fracturing under the weight of Joffrey's cruelty and the Tyrell's ambitions, was there not a chance the North could seize an advantage like never before? Yet such a weapon also came with unimaginable danger. The Targaryens had kept dragons for centuries and still lost them in the end. For all he knew, dragons could be an unchained doom. Jon read the wariness in his face. I'm not suggesting we leap to free the dragon from its shell, if that's even what it is. But knowledge is power, and if we reveal it carefully, we might unite the realm. Or we could brand ourselves as abominations, traitors. I don't know. I came to you because you're king in the North now, and we're bound by blood. Whatever is done, we must do it together. Robb nodded slowly. He wanted to embrace the idea, to call up the great lords and rally them around a new northern dream. But he also felt a creeping sense of the unknown. First, I want to see this egg. And second, we must talk strategy. The White Walkers, the state of the realm, the Lannisters, we can't face all threats at once without planning. You speak of uniting the realm, but we're still at war. Jon's jaw tightened. That war might soon become meaningless if the threat from the North overruns us. The dead care little for crowns. They fell silent for a moment, the flicker of torchlight dancing upon the walls, making the old Stark sigil appear to move in the gloom. Robb thought of his father, who had gone south to preserve some semblance of honor and justice, and paid the ultimate price. Ned Stark had believed in the realm and its laws, but the realm had shown him only betrayal. Now here was Jon, urging a unity that might be impossible. And yet, if the threat was truly so grave, how could he not at least try? They left the solar and made their way down into the crypts by torchlight, accompanied by Grey Wind, Ghost, and a handful of Robb's most trusted guards. The deeper they descended, the heavier the air became, thick with centuries of dust and sorrow. Robb felt the weight of his ancestors pressing in on him. They passed the tombs of old lords of Winterfell, each guarded by a statue with a dire wolf at its feet. One of them, marked by a likeness of Ned Stark, stood freshly chiseled, though it was only a symbolic resting place. The memory twisted Robb's heart. If only his father's bones could have been brought home. Jon led them further, to a part of the crypts that Robb had never seen. Rubble barred the way, but there was a narrow gap, just large enough to squeeze through. Two of Robb's guards had to remove their armor to fit. On the other side lay a corridor lined with old braziers rusted beyond use. The stone underfoot was slick, a faint trickle of water somewhere in the darkness. Robb could smell the hot springs at the edge of his senses. Finally, they emerged into a modest-sized vault. At its center lay a raised pedestal of sorts, though much of it was chipped and worn away. And there, resting in a shallow basin, was a shape that looked like a large chunk of petrified rock, dappled with faint ridges and scales etched in some impossible pattern. Jon's torchlight danced across its surface, revealing a sheen that reminded Robb of molten obsidian, blackish with undertones of red. Tentatively, Robb stepped forward. He extended his gloved hand, half expecting the rock to be cold. But the moment his palm touched it, a deep warmth rose through the leather, like the embers of a banked fire. He jerked his hand away, startled. A hush fell upon them all, the only sound the uneasy shifting of the guards behind him. Grey Wind sniffed at the egg, ears pressed flat in caution. Ghost, Jon's pale dire wolf, uttered a low, almost reverent growl, as if acknowledging something ancient. Robb felt his heart pounding in his chest. The legends of his childhood, the tales old and used to spin about the long night, the last hero, dragons in the sky, seemed to converge here in this forgotten crypt beneath his home. It was too real to deny. This was no ordinary stone. Something pulsed with life beneath that hardened shell, a deep, slow heartbeat from ages past. Jon observed him quietly. "You see why I sent for you?" Robb nodded. Words felt small. He stared at the egg for a long moment before turning away. There was no immediate solution, no blueprint for how to handle such a thing. He only knew that the North's survival, and perhaps all of Westeros, depended on what they decided. He thought of the savage politics swirling around King's Landing, the Lannisters' tenuous hold, the Tyrell ambitions. If the North could rally around this revelation, they might push all the way to the capital and break the power of those who had murdered Ned Stark. The old thirst for vengeance stirred, but it warred with caution. A dragon was not a simple warhammer to be wielded. It was a living creature, tied to a legacy that had shaped entire eras. They sealed off the passage after that, placing 2 of their most loyal men to guard the entrance. In the Great Hall, Robb convened a gathering of the Northern Lords who were present, small in number but influential, and shared a heavily edited version of the discovery. He spoke of a hidden vault of old relics that hinted at Targaryen presence, but he kept the explicit mention of the egg's living warmth to a narrow circle. Himself, Jon, Caitlin, and a chosen few. The reaction from the other lords was a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some, like Lord Bolton's representative, the Dreadfort Lord himself was suspiciously absent, seemed more intrigued than alarmed. Others, like Great Jon Umber, were openly skeptical. But they all recognized the significance of a connection to dragons, especially with rumors from Essos that Daenerys Targaryen's 3 dragons were no longer mere hatchlings but growing, unstoppable forces. Robb addressed them with firm resolve. "We must prepare. The realm is unsteady. The Lannisters lose ground daily. Their forces are stretched thin. The Tyrells feast in King's Landing, but they only bide their time for the next shift of power. Here in the North, we stand ready to strike if we must. Meanwhile, the greatest threat may come from beyond the wall. My brother Jon has seen the Whites, the army of the dead." He paused, allowing the hush in the hall to deepen. "We cannot defeat an enemy like that alone. We need alliances, or we need a power so immense it can burn away the darkness." The conversation turned to how best to proceed. Caitlin urged caution, counseling that they reach out to the Vale, to the Riverlands, and even to Stannis Baratheon, who still clung to his claim on Dragonstone, rumored to be dabbling in dark magics. If the threat of the White Walkers was truly real, perhaps the entire realm could rally. Yet old rivalries and mistrust complicated matters. Stannis was known for his rigid sense of right and wrong, but would he welcome the news of a dragon egg in Stark hands? Or would he claim it for himself as the rightful king? In the end, they decided on a 2-pronged strategy. Robb would lead the main host south once more, but this time with the possibility of an unexpected advantage. The rumor of a dragon beneath Winterfell might be quietly circulated, sowing fear among the Lannisters and any other southern lords who thought the North was spent. Meanwhile, Jon, having effectively left the Night's Watch due to the extraordinary circumstances, would recruit a separate force. He had ties to the Free Folk, wildlings who might be persuaded to join a bold campaign if it meant surviving the coming winter. Jon's bond with them, along with the promise of forging a new homeland for them in the Giftlands south of the Wall, could be leveraged to create a second front. If the North advanced on King's Landing while an army of Free Folk and Northern cavalry struck from an unexpected quarter, they might corner the Lannisters before any reinforcements could rally. That evening, as Winterfell's fires burned bright, Robb paced on the ramparts, considering the enormity of what lay before him. The snows had not yet begun in earnest, but a crispness hung in the air that spoke of winter's approach. He gripped the hilt of his sword, recalling the last time he had felt so uncertain. The War of the Five Kings had splintered the realm, cost so many lives, and gained him little. Yet the letter from Jon had rekindled a sense of unity he hadn't felt since the day he was declared king in the North. Perhaps this was the path they were meant to walk, brothers in arms, forging a new destiny for the Starks. For the first time in many moons, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. They departed Winterfell in separate groups. Robb took the main host, leaving behind a small garrison to protect the castle and, crucially, to guard the crypts. Before leaving, he revisited the egg with Jon, lighting a single torch to illuminate the vault. As if sensing their presence, the egg's warmth pulsed, and for a heartbeat, Robb thought he saw the faintest flicker of red light run beneath the stone scales. Jon placed a hand on his shoulder. Neither man spoke. Whatever fate awaited them, it was bound now to. Oh, this fragile possibility of dragon fire. Jon left for the wall, or rather, for the outskirts of it. The Night's Watch might not welcome him with open arms since abandoning his vows was tantamount to desertion. But Jon carried with him the burden of leadership he had once held as Lord Commander, a role that earned him both respect and hatred among the brothers. He had parted from them not out of malice but necessity. He believed that the only chance for humanity's survival lay in forging alliances beyond tradition. To that end, he would gather free folk, loyal rangers, and any bannermen from the north who had the courage to follow him. His plan was audacious, to slip south along the coast and link with northern sympathizers in the Vale, using hidden passes to avoid direct confrontation until the moment was ripe. Then, in concert with Robb's southern push, they would strike at King's Landing or wherever the Lannister strength manifested. As the weeks passed, Robb found himself in the Riverlands once again, reassembling the battered remains of his alliances. Lord Walder Frey remained a tenuous ally at best, though the old man had not openly betrayed them in this alternate turn of events. The horrors of the Red Wedding had never come to pass in quite the same way. Instead, the Freys were sullen, resentful, but still bound by shaky oaths. The Blackfish, Brynden Tully, helped manage the Riverlord's forces, ensuring that the supply lines were secure. The winds of rumor carried whispers about a dragon in the north, though none could confirm it. Some lords scoffed at the notion as idle fancy, but others, more perceptive, worried that House Stark might indeed command a monstrous secret. Robb did nothing to dispel those fears. Fear, after all, was its own weapon. Meanwhile, Jon traveled across the bitter, windswept plains beyond the Wall, guided by Tormund Giantsbane, who still referred to him as the Crow-turned Wolf. Word of a new alliance among the free folk spread quickly. Many had lost their faith in the Night's Watch after the battles that claimed Mance Rayder, yet Jon's deeds at Hardhome and his willingness to treat them as equals had not been forgotten. Gradually, tents rose in the foothills, and men, women, and even giants arrived to hear what the former Lord Commander had to say. He spoke of a realm in chaos, a southern king unfit to rule, and a Stark king who would welcome them as free men in the north. He spun visions of farmland made available to those who would fight against the White Walkers and any southern lord who tried to keep them in chains. If they joined him, they might carve out a true place for themselves. If not, the coming winter would trap them in a land of ice and death with no recourse but annihilation. His words worked. Though many free folk were suspicious, enough remembered the boy with the Valyrian steel sword who had defended them against the Whites who had risked his life for them at Hardhome. They pledged to fight. By the time Jon turned south, he had a motley host of wildlings, spearwives, and warriors from various clans. They lacked discipline in the traditional sense, but they had fire in their hearts and an abiding hatred for the undead. For once, a portion of the Night's Watch itself, those loyal to Jon despite his supposed desertion, slipped away under cover of darkness to march with him. Their black cloaks turned inside out, they became the crows who had flown the nest. Among them was Ed Tollett, grim-faced but determined. The sight of him, stoic and reliable, made Jon's heart ache for the watch he'd once served. He knew well there might be no returning to the Wall as a brother after this. But if they saved Westeros from doom, perhaps their sin of desertion would be forgiven or overshadowed by greater events. From hidden vantage points along the rocky hills near the coast, Jon's scouts monitored the movements of the Vale's knights. Littlefinger still sat as protector of the Vale in name, but the young Lord Robert Arryn was a weak figurehead. Some of the Vale's more stalwart knights, those who still honored ties with the Starks, sent messages of quiet support. Jon worked diligently with them, forging a corridor through which his forces could pass, avoiding the major strongholds that might alert the Lannisters or their allies. The presence of wildlings in the Vale was sure to provoke a reaction if discovered, so secrecy was paramount. Once they broke beyond the Bloody Gate, they could slip into the Crownlands or the Riverlands, whichever route seemed safest, depending on the Lannisters' movements. Robb, for his part, orchestrated a steady push through the Riverlands, capturing small but key Lannister outposts along the way. The king in the north no longer rushed headlong into open battle. He fought with cunning. He spread rumors, feigned retreats, and used the rugged terrain to his advantage. Lord Bolton, ever watchful, lingered behind with his troops, quietly sizing up each victory. Caitlin served as diplomat among the lords who might be swayed to the Stark cause. She had an edge in her voice these days, a sorrowful steel that took root after Ned's death. Yet that steel also commanded respect. More than once, a hesitant bannerman bent the knee when confronted by her unwavering gaze. Bit by bit, Robb's forces swelled, and the Lannisters found themselves on the defensive. Tensions rose in King's Landing. Joffrey, unpredictable and cruel, lashed out at his council. Tywin Lannister, had he still lived, might have quashed any rebellion with cold precision, but the old lion had succumbed, this time through an unexpected illness or misadventure, leaving the throne more vulnerable than ever. Cersei clung to power through her manipulations, but the small folk whispered of doom. The Tyrells watched closely, ever ready to pivot should the tides of war shift. The rumors of a northern dragon spread through Flea Bottom like wildfire, fueling speculation that a great fire-breathing beast would soon reduce the city to ashes. Some prayed for salvation, others for mercy, but no one knew the truth. When Jon's host finally emerged into the Crownlands, it did so with shocking speed. Using old smugglers' routes and guided by Vale Knights who despised Littlefinger's rule, they bypassed the usual patrols and struck near the Rosby Road. By then, Robb was already staging battles along the Blackwater Rush to the west of the city, drawing the Lannister armies out. The two-front assault was underway. King's Landing, used to threats from the west or the south, now found enemies approaching from multiple angles. The few loyal Gold Cloaks scrambled to fortify the walls, but the city's defenders were scattered, unsure where the real threat lay. Jon and his wildling allies moved with practiced stealth, slipping past farmland and burning holdfasts. The Crownlands lords, many of them impoverished by the war, had little love for the Lannisters. Some opened their gates to Jon's host, pledging no resistance in return for fair treatment. Others resisted and were swiftly overrun, their meager garrisons ill-prepared for the ferocity of wildling raiders and the precision of disillusioned Night's Watch men. Jon spared those who surrendered, mindful that cruelty would only breed further hatred. He remained a Stark even if the name was overshadowed by the brand of snow. Each day, as they drew closer to King's Landing, Jon thought of the dragon egg beneath Winterfell. He wondered if some cosmic fate now guided him or if it was merely chance. He still felt the unnatural warmth on his palm, a memory that sent shivers down his spine. What if, at this very moment, that egg was stirring, preparing to hatch in the darkness? What if dragons indeed returned to the world, not just across the narrow sea but right here in the North's possession? He had no illusions about controlling such a beast. But the symbol it represented, the raw, destructive power, might be enough to reshape the realm. Robb's army reached the outskirts of King's Landing days ahead of schedule. The Lannister forces, commanded by Kevan Lannister and bolstered by a fraction of the Tyrell host, attempted a stand at the western gate. Scouts reported that the imp, Tyrion Lannister, was nowhere to be found, perhaps hidden away in some side scheme or exiled again. Still, the city's defenders remained formidable. The formidable walls that once repelled Stannis' ships now loomed over Robb's men. Caitlin advised negotiating, but the memory of Ned Stark's fate in that city left Robb cold to the idea of parley. The Lannisters had taught him that overtures of peace often masked knives in the dark. Yet he also recalled Jon's warning that the true enemy lay beyond petty crowns. If he burned King's Landing to the ground, how would that help unite the realm against the White Walkers? As dawn broke on the day of the final approach, Robb stood on a rise overlooking the city. Gray wind prowled beside him, ears forward. In the distance, the sprawl of King's Landing shimmered in the early light, 7 gates marking its perimeter. The Red Keep perched high on Aegon's Hill. He had once thought it an impregnable fortress. Now, with the city in chaos, perhaps it could fall. He gazed eastward, wondering if Jon's host would appear. They had agreed upon no direct signal, relying on timing and the confusion of the defenders. The plan was to strike simultaneously, with Robb engaging the western defenses while Jon led his host against the north or northeast gates, drawing the city guard in multiple directions. Suddenly, horns echoed from the city walls. The silhouette of movement suggested a force approaching from the east. The Lannisters scrambled, unsure where to concentrate. Robb seized the moment. He ordered the horns to sound their challenge, summoning the North's cavalry. Rows of riders emerged, banners of the dire wolf flapping in the wind. At Robb's signal, they thundered forward. Arrows rained down from the city walls, but the archers' formations were haphazard and the cavalry quickly closed the distance. The main gate was locked and barred, but an outer barricade had been hastily constructed in the city's panic. The Great Jon led the charge, bellowing war cries that echoed over the din. Behind them, infantry advanced with battering rams. The crash of steel and the roar of men rose in chaotic unison. Robb directed his forces with practiced calm, flanking pockets of Lannister pikemen. From the corner of his eye, he saw Grey Wind leap at a knight who nearly speared one of his bannermen. The direwolf's ferocity sent men scattering. Overhead, the city's walls felt taller than mountains, each crenellation spouting archers. But the old discipline of the Lannisters was absent, replaced by fear and confusion. Despite the carnage, Robb sensed that victory was near, if only they could maintain the assault. Meanwhile, on the northeastern side, Jon led a wedge of wildlings and loyal knights watch defectors against a smaller gate. Catapults slung rocks and debris against the walls, courtesy of the few Vale knights who risked open defiance. The gate was battered, but not yet broken. As the fighting raged, Jon felt a surge of doubt. He remembered the oath he had sworn to defend the realms of men. Here he was, attacking the capital of that realm, forcing an overthrow. But he told himself it was necessary. Cersei and Joffrey had allowed the realm to rot from within, ignoring the true threat. If new leadership could unify Westeros, then perhaps they could turn north and face the White Walkers with a united host. The alternative was to let the realm remain divided, easy prey for the dead. Tormund's voice boomed nearby. "We break them or they break us, Crow." No time for second thoughts. With that, the wildling leader took a sledgehammer to a half-splintered door, smashing at its hinges. The wood cracked, and within moments, wildlings flooded in, shrieking war cries. The city defenders inside stood in terrified confusion, many throwing down their weapons at the sight of savage free folk surging through the breach. Jon pressed forward, Ghost at his side, blade at the ready. He had killed men before, but it never got easier. The clang of metal, the screams, and the smell of blood became a vivid swirl around him. He cut down a guardsman who raised a halberd at him, then parried another's thrust. Ghost tore at the ankles of another soldier, sending him crashing to the ground. Step by step, they carved out a foothold within King's Landing's walls. On the western side, the outer gate was finally shattered under the weight of the rams. Robb's forces poured in, the high-pitched wail of trumpets mixing with the howls of direwolves. Civilians fled in panic, rushing to find shelter in the twisting alleys. Some cried out for mercy, others cursed the Starks. Among Robb's ranks, discipline held, though a few men broke away to plunder. Robb and his officers tried to keep order, remembering how Tywin Lannister had sacked the city during Robert's rebellion. This was not meant to be a massacre. Yet war rarely unfolds neatly. Fires broke out in the confusion. Smoke curled into the sky, and the clangor of swords struck an ugly melody through the streets. At last, the combined forces converged near the Red Keep, with only a portion of the Lannister guard blocking their way. Joffrey Baratheon was rumored to be inside, but no sign of him appeared on the ramparts. The boy king who had once demanded Ned Stark's had now cowered behind thick walls. As the last line of defense buckled, Robb and Jon found themselves face to face among the rubble-strewn courtyard. The surprise at seeing each other there, in the heart of King's Landing, was overshadowed by mutual relief. Each was bloodied, exhausted, but alive. They clasped forearms amidst the din, a silent affirmation of their shared purpose. A horn sounded from the main gate of the Red Keep. Lannister soldiers retreated, forming a desperate shield wall. Robb raised his voice, calling for them to lay down arms. Some complied, dropping swords with trembling hands. Others fought to the death, too deep in fear or hatred to surrender. One by one, they fell under the combined might of the Northmen and wildlings. Finally, the courtyard fell silent except for the crackle of distant fires. Robb led the way up the grand stairs, Grey Wind trotting ahead. Jon flanked him, a cadre of free folk behind him, Ed Tollett and Tormund among them. The large bronze doors leading into the throne room had been barred from within, but it took little time to smash them in. Smoke drifted into the high-ceiling space. The throne room was dimly lit, the iron throne looming on its raised dais like some twisted idol of swords. Cersei stood before it, her gown askew, hair in disarray, her green eyes blazing with hate. Beside her towered the mountainous figure of Ser Gregor Clegane, his visage hidden by his helm. A handful of gold cloaks and Kingsguard ringed them, swords at the ready. And there, slumped on the steps at the foot of the throne, was Joffrey, sobbing with fury or terror. Perhaps both. Robb's voice rang out. "Surrender, your grace. The city has fallen." Joffrey spat, his eyes wild. "You have no right. I am the king. I'll have your head for this." No one moved to defend his words. Cersei placed a hand on the pommel of a sword at her side. a rare sight to see her armed. Her lips curled in a sneer. "You traitors come to claim the throne? Will the wolf sit where the lion once ruled? You are no better than the usurper's dogs." Jon said nothing but kept his sword raised, eyes flicking between Clegane and the Kingsguard. Tormund gripped his axe, a wicked grin on his face. He had little love for southern aristocracy. Robb ascended another step. He could taste the acrid smoke in his mouth. "Your reign ends here. I offer a choice. Surrender peacefully and stand trial for your crimes, or resist and die." Joffrey trembled, his voice cracking. "Mother, kill them. Kill them all. I'll feed them to the dogs." The hysterical edge in his tone only highlighted the hopelessness of the situation. Gregor Clegane, monstrous as ever, seemed poised to strike. But even he must have realized the futility. The force arrayed against them far outnumbered the few defenders in the throne room. Cersei looked from Robb to Jon, her face twisting with a regal contempt. Something in her eyes suggested she might plunge the entire room into carnage rather than yield. Before she could decide, Joffrey lurched forward, shrieking, hand flailing as if to strike Robb. Grey Wind responded instantly, launching at the Boy King, teeth bared. The swift violence of the direwolf took everyone by surprise. In a heartbeat, Joffrey was on the ground, screaming as Grey Wind's jaws locked on his arm. Cersei screamed, drawing her sword, but it was too late. The man behind her, Ser Meryn Trant, lunged at Grey Wind. Jon, reacting in a flash, parried Ser Meryn's blow, while Tormund axe swung at another guard, opening the man's chest. Chaos exploded. Gregor Clegane roared, swinging his massive blade. Robb narrowly dodged, trying to call Grey Wind off Joffrey. But the direwolf, provoked by the boy's shrill curses, had sunk its teeth deeper. Blood slicked the floor. Cersei let out a keening wail, slashing wildly at whoever came near. She caught one wildling in the throat. Robb tried to tackle her, but she twisted away like a cornered lioness, seeking an escape route. The chaos was over as quickly as it began. Meryn Trant lay in a pool of his own blood, Tormund panting over him. Clegane, caked in gore, faced off against Jon, their blades shrieking as they met. Jon's Valyrian steel glimmered with pale light in the gloom, but Gregor's brute strength threatened to overwhelm him. Then Ed Tollett appeared behind the mountain, driving a spear into a gap in the knight's armor. Gregor howled, turning to crush Ed, giving Jon the opening to plunge his sword beneath the visor of Gregor's helm. The giant man spasmed, blood pouring out. With a final shudder, the mountain toppled. Joffrey's screams had faded into a gurgling whimper as Grey Wind's jaws found his throat. Robb finally wrestled his direwolf off, but the damage was done. The Boy King bled out, eyes bulging in shock. Cersei, splattered with her son's blood, stared in horror. She sank to her knees, dropping her sword, a guttural sob ripping from her lips. Robb looked down at Joffrey's lifeless body, feeling a curious detachment. This was the one who had ordered his father's execution, who had tormented Sansa, who had threatened the North with all manner of cruelty. Gone in an instant, an end that was far less ceremonious than the grand fury of war, yet perhaps more fitting. Jon stood over Gregor's corpse, chest heaving, face haunted by the violence of the moment. Tormund spat at the mountain's body, muttering curses. The handful of remaining defenders threw down their weapons. Footsteps echoed as more Northmen and wildlings poured into the throne room, momentarily awed by the sight of the Iron Throne. Robb spotted Cersei crawling toward Joffrey's body, sobbing. He felt no pity for her, only a numb sense that the war for King's Landing was done. Robb's gaze lifted to the throne, that twisted, spiked seat forged from the swords of Aegon's enemies. It loomed like a dark specter, seeming to whisper of the blood spilled for power. He turned to Jon, who met his eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. Capturing the throne was one thing, holding it and saving the realm was another. And looming behind it all was the threat of the White Walkers, unstoppable if Westeros remained divided. Could they unite the Seven Kingdoms under a new banner, under the dire wolf, when Winter Spectre prowled beyond the wall. Wearily, Robb raised his voice so all could hear. The city is ours. Let there be no needless slaughter. Any who yield shall be spared in the name of House Stark. We take no joy in this victory, for the true war still awaits us in the north. He gestured for his captains to secure the Red Keep. Some men rushed to the dungeons, others to the royal apartments. A hush fell on the throne room, broken only by Cersei's sobs and the crackle of distant fires. Blood pooled around the dais. The Iron Throne stood silent, an emblem of conquest that had cost countless lives. Robb let out a long breath, heart heavy. He had dreamed of avenging his father, of ending the Lannisters' tyranny, of regaining the North's freedom. Now that the moment was here, triumph tasted bitter. He looked to Jon again, recalling the warmth of the dragon egg beneath Winterfell. If that relic hatched, if dragons soared once more, how would the realm react? Would they see the Starks as saviors or conquerors? Outside the throne room, the city reeled from the invasion. Yet, in the coming hours, as the Northmen and wildlings patrolled, a kind of stunned calm set in. Bells rang to signal the city's surrender. The Tyrells, for their part, retreated behind closed doors, waiting to see how the new order would treat them. Robb sent immediate word that Sansa, if she were still in the city, must be found and brought to safety. He also had men searching for Arya, though the last he heard she was missing. Caitlin joined those searches with grim determination. Once the capital was secured, plans had to be made to fend off any Lannister loyalists still in the field and to quell any civil unrest within the city. Jon climbed the steps to stand by Robb. In the swirling dust and half-light, his black cloak was torn, his sword stained red, but his eyes held clarity. "It's done. Almost," he said. Robb gave a terse nod. Almost. He could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on him. Northmen, southern lords, wildlings. All waiting to see what the new king in the north would do next. He had claimed King's Landing, but not the hearts of its people. Would he sit upon the Iron Throne? Declare the independence of the north? Or strive to unite all under a single rule? Cersei's broken wails echoed in the hall, a mother mourning her monstrous son. At the edge of his vision, Robb saw men carrying away Joffrey's body, a smear of blood marking the path. Grey Wind was panting, muzzle stained, ears back as if he sensed the tension. A wave of exhaustion washed over Robb. He thought of his father's lessons about justice and mercy. He thought of the threat of the White Walkers creeping ever closer with the passing weeks. Then he looked at Jon, recalling the vow they had made in Winterfell's crypts. They had decided that saving the realm was worth more than a crown. Perhaps Robb realized the Iron Throne must be used, not merely possessed. He squared his shoulders and raised his voice for all in the throne room to hear. "Hear me. The reign of King Joffrey Baratheon is ended. The crown is in our hands, but we aim not to rule through terror. We aim to protect this realm from the true darkness creeping from beyond the wall. The North remembers, and we shall unite the 7 kingdoms or see them fall beneath the tide of the dead." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion, hope, fear. Robb was certain that across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen tended to her dragons, forging her own destiny. But here, in this blood-stained city, a second chance was emerging. Perhaps they could rally all corners of Westeros, Stormlands, Reach, Dorne, the Iron Islands to stand together against the winter's horrors. The cost would be high. The realm was weary of war, suspicious of any new king. But if they held a living dragon, if that egg beneath Winterfell hatched, yes, that might be enough to convince even the most stubborn lord. Jon offered a slight, grim smile. "We'll need every ally we can find. And if that egg does hatch," Robb felt the swirl of possibility. "Then we'll unleash fire and ice against this foe. For now, we rebuild. We must quickly form alliances, supply lines, everything needed to march north with an army that can face death itself." Jon nodded, steadying himself on the hilt of his blade. Winter is coming. Outside, flames danced on the city's walls and the great September spells told in uncertain sorrow. The dawn light spilled through broken windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted around the Iron Throne. Surrounded by the hush of uneasy victory, 2 brothers, once separated by circumstance, stood on the cusp of a new era. Beyond the horizon, the White Walkers stirred in the far north, their silent ranks growing with each passing night. Yet for the first time in a long while, hope flickered like a single torch in deep darkness. Their father's words lived on in them, guiding them toward a fate neither could fully imagine. Perhaps it was fitting that in the city forged by Dragonfire it would be the wolves of winter who now held sway, preparing to face a threat that made mortal squabbles seem pale by comparison. And deep beneath Winterfell, in a vault untouched by the sun for centuries, an egg the color of obsidian lay in stillness, its interior heartbeat slow and steady, waiting for the day it would awaken to a world at war yet again. Dark gray plumes of smoke twisted into the sky above King's Landing as the sun struggled to rise the next morning, its pallid rays illuminating a broken city. Shouts and laments echoed through the winding streets where corpses and debris littered the cobblestones. Northmen patrolled in small, disciplined groups, barking orders to raucous wildlings who had never before seen such towering walls and sprawling districts. Steam drifted from their breaths in the early chill, and the sense that something monumental had happened clung to the air like ash. In the throne room, flickering torchlight revealed the fresh scars of battle. A shattered door, blood pooled beneath skewed columns, and bodies dragged to one side for later disposal. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, its metal blades catching sparks of light. Silent and empty, it commanded the space like a malevolent idol. Across from it, huddled figures shuffled in half-supplication or defeat. A number of Lannister soldiers had surrendered, kneeling on the cold stone with wrists bound, too exhausted or terrified to resist further. Some of the gold-trimmed armor was dented and stained. None dared to lift their eyes. Robb Stark stood among his bannermen, hands clasped behind his back. His face carried new lines of strain, as though the victory weighed heavier on him than any defeat might have done. King in the north, yet here he was, the conqueror of King's Landing. This was not a dream he had ever nurtured. Though he had marched south to avenge Ned Stark, to reclaim Sansa and Arya, and to carve out the North's independence, he hadn't truly imagined taking the Iron Throne itself. But war and fate had pushed him onward, step by step, until the city lay in his hands. A dozen steps behind Robb stood Jon Snow, circumspect and silent. His black cloak was torn at the hem, showing a swath of battered mail beneath. Though he had once been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, now he stood as brother and ally to Robb, an uneasy champion in a war that grew more complicated each day. The sight of King's Landing subdued by the combined might of Northmen and free folk was staggering. They had come from different worlds, some from towering castles and some from ice-swept camps beyond the wall, and yet here they stood together victorious. If only that triumph felt less hollow. Cersei Lannister was nowhere to be seen in the throne room. She had been carried away by several of Robb's guards the night before, delirious with grief and rage. Ser Gregor lay dead, Joffrey lay dead. What remained of the royal family's hold on the city was in shambles. The great September spells had tolled late into the night in a muddle of mourning and alarm until Robb finally gave the order for the tolling to stop. Now, in that loaded silence, the question on every tongue was who would claim the Iron Throne and what that would mean for the future of the Seven Kingdoms. A swirl of commotion drew Robb's attention to the corridor leading into the throne room. Catelyn Stark stepped through, hair pulled back in a severe braid, wearing a cloak of dark gray wool. Her face was as somber as a tombstone. Behind her trailed several Northmen bearing arms, along with one of the city's gold-cloaked guards who had laid down his sword the night before. He was speaking in anxious tones, describing something about bread riots in Flea Bottom. The city, leaderless for so long, was on the brink of chaos. Food was scarce, fear rampant. If the victors sought to rule, they would have to impose order swiftly or face a swelling tide of rebellion in the streets. Robb raised a hand for silence. The guard fell quiet. Catelyn's eyes found her son, and for a moment, the anguish and relief in her expression warred. She closed the distance, speaking softly but urgently. We've discovered hundreds of wounded, small folk and soldiers alike. The city's maesters are overwhelmed. There's talk of more trouble in the alleys. Fires still smolder in a few districts. We must secure the city before it tears itself apart. Robb nodded, adopting a mantle of command he had never expected to wear so far from home. Send out patrols. Establish safe zones for the wounded. We have fresh supplies from the Riverlands, see that they're distributed. Any man who surrenders or is injured is to be treated fairly, as best we can. We've spilled enough blood already. Catelyn's features softened in approval, though worry lingered in her eyes. I'll handle it, she promised, gesturing to the waiting men to follow her. They turned and left at once. Jon cleared his throat. We should also seek out the Tyrells. They might be your best chance at preventing total disorder in the city. The small folk still see them as providers of food, especially Marjorie Tyrell. If the Tyrells recognize your claim, or at least your presence here, that could settle nerves. Robb inhaled as though tasting the dust in the air. Yes, I'll send an envoy. However, I suspect the Tyrells will be as cautious as a cornered animal. They had a hand in power here, but with Joffrey gone, they might attempt their own claim or at least try to wrest concessions. Jon stepped forward, quiet. We don't have much time for extended politicking. There's still the threat beyond the wall. Robb's gaze flicked to the Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of melted swords, then back to Jon. 1,000 uncertainties crowded his thoughts, but the one thing that rang clear was the threat from the north. The White Walkers would not slow their advance because the Starks had conquered King's Landing. The world was bigger than these petty wars. He gave a brief nod. Yes, we'll keep our focus, but we can't march away from King's Landing as if it no longer matters. If the realm stays divided, we'll never stand a chance against the dead. Jon's brow furrowed. I'll ride north soon. Winterfell must be fortified. And he lowered his voice. Someone must watch over that egg. At the mention of the egg, Robb felt a low tremor of awe and trepidation. Had it grown warmer in their absence? Was some ancient life stirring beneath Winterfell's crypts? They had not dared to share the secret with more than a trusted few, but rumors abounded of a dragon hidden somewhere in the north. Those whispers alone might keep certain lords at bay. Fear of dragonfire was enough to command caution in any war council. Yet if the egg truly hatched, what then? Robb considered Jon's words. You're right. The egg is too powerful a secret to leave unguarded. But let's first ensure we have some measure of stability here. We can't risk handing King's Landing over to opportunists while we scramble north. Even as he said it, he could imagine the chaos that would erupt if they simply departed. The Tyrells would close in, or perhaps the Martells would muster. The remnants of the Lannisters might attempt to retake the city with Sellsword companies. King's Landing was not easily tamed, but to abandon it outright would mean risking the entire realm's collapse. They exited the throne room together, leaving a small contingent of Northmen to secure it. The corridors rang with echoes of footsteps and hushed conversation. Herein there lay more signs of the previous night's struggle, a fallen tapestry, the bloodstains of an unlucky guard. They passed through a pair of tall oak doors into the outer courtyard, where sunlight glimmered against a thin veil of dust. Soldiers, civilians, and stable hands wove in knots of frantic movement. Horses snorted in makeshift pens, and crows circled overhead, drawn by the stench of death. Robb gestured for a cluster of banner men, Lord Karstark's representative, Lord Umber, and several others to gather around. Their voices mingled in a swirl of exhaustion and a measure of pride. The men had marched countless miles for this moment, fighting from Moat Cailin to the Riverlands and now here, in the capital. Some looked uneasy, as though expecting an ambush at any second. But most exuded a certain grim satisfaction. The Lannisters had held them in contempt, and now House Stark reigned triumphant within the city walls. Lord Umber slapped his huge hands together. We should find where the boy king's body is. Put it on a pike, maybe? That'll send a message. Robb's eyes flashed. No, there's been enough butchery. Let him be buried with whatever remains of the royal family if they so choose. We gain nothing by desecrating corpses. The great Jon grunted, clearly displeased, but he gave a reluctant nod. The other lords watched Robb carefully. He sensed they too were testing him, measuring how he would rule. The North had always had its own customs, more straightforward and harsh than the southern courts. Yet if he was to lead not just the North but possibly all of Westeros, he would need to show a different kind of strength, tempered, just, but unyielding when necessary. He thought of his father's lessons. Ned Stark had never been a cruel man, but no one doubted his capacity for justice. Jon said nothing as he stood to one side, a silent pillar in black. The wildlings who had accompanied him were scattered around the yard, their curiosity almost childlike as they gawked at the Red Keep's high walls. Some rummaged through the stables, others tested the thickness of gates and portcullises, murmuring about how easily they might be scaled or broken. Tormund Giantsbane spotted Jon and waved, striding over with a broad grin. Crow. And you, Wolf King? Tormund jerked his chin at Robb in a gesture of respect. Quite a haul, this city. More folks than I've ever seen in one place. The smell is worse than a midden heap in midsummer, though. Robb allowed a small curve of his lips. King's Landing rarely smells pleasant, or so I've heard. Tormund let out a bark of laughter. Well, we'll adapt. My folk wonder how long we'll be staying. The open road calls to them. But we fought at your side and we'll stay if you need us. Jon inclined his head. If trouble brews, we can't spare the free folk just yet. But there's no sense in them remaining in the city if it's not necessary. They should rest, gather supplies. Then we'll move them north once we're certain we can hold the capital. Tormund scratched at his beard, glancing around as though searching for the best vantage point. As you say, but be swift. Sitting in one place for too long makes wildlings uneasy. With a roguish wink, he turned and lumbered off, pausing to shout some ribald comment at a group of wide-eyed stable hands. Robb exhaled. The day stretched out before them, filled with 1,000 tasks, each as crucial as the last. He conferred with his mother again in the presence of senior bannermen, coordinating the distribution of rations, the rounding up of any rogue gold cloaks still causing trouble, and the management of the city gates to allow supply wagons in but keep out any opportunistic sellswords. The Tyrells, rumor suggested, had retreated to the manors they kept near the dragon pit, though no one had seen Marjorie or her father since last night's fighting. Robb sent a small party under the Stark banner to find them and deliver a summons to the Red Keep. By midday, the sun stood high, though a haze lingered over King's Landing, mixing smoke with the sea breeze. Robb walked the battlements, scanning the horizon. The Blackwater Bay sparkled in pale winter light, and beyond it lay the uncertain rest of the realm. He caught sight of scattered ships in the harbor, merchant cogs, fishing vessels, a few warships once loyal to the crown. If they had any cunning, they would remain anchored rather than attempt to flee. Out on the main roads, refugees poured back into the city, hoping that with the Lannister grip broken, life might return to something more bearable. But hunger, disease, and desperation could spark worse violence if not managed. Robb's stomach nodded at the enormity of the challenge. A voice at his shoulder made him turn. It was Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, his uncle, who had led much of the scouting force through the Riverlands. The old knight's face was set in grim lines. So here we stand, nephew, at the seat of power. Careful, or it will devour you as it has devoured so many before. Robb rested a forearm on the crenellation. I have no wish to remain in King's Landing forever. The North remains my home. But if we must hold the city to unify the realm against the threat in the North, so be it. Blackfish studied him thoughtfully. Words well spoken. You'll have challengers, though. The Tyrells may press you for a marriage alliance, or for dominion in the Reach. The Martells might demand vengeance for Elia and her children, though that was a crime of the Lannisters. And then there's Stannis Baratheon somewhere in the east. Last I heard, he was in Dragonstone, claiming it as his rightful seat. Robb managed a weary smile. So many threats, and each one wanting a piece of the realm. We must speak with all of them eventually, try to forge alliances or at least treaties. The dead won't care about old feuds. Blackfish placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. You're doing your father's memory proud, lad. Keep your wits, and don't let them manipulate you. This city is full of vipers. Robb nodded in silent gratitude. He let his gaze wander to the rolling landscape that extended beyond the walls. In that moment he thought of Winterfell's crypts. The egg. What manner of destiny might come from a Targaryen dragon egg hidden under the seat of House Stark? So many mysteries, so many burdens. He made his way to the royal apartments afterward, accompanied by a few hand-picked guards and Jon. Cersei Lannister had been confined there, under watch, to prevent any attempts at suicide or escape. Robb was not inclined to show her gentleness, but neither was he eager to let a prisoner starve. He remembered how Joffrey had treated Sansa, like a pawn, a victim of his sadistic whims. Robb wanted no part of that cruelty. If the Starks aspired to rule with honor, they must show it even to the conquered. Still, the weight of all that had happened between the families made him dread facing her again. When they entered, they found the apartments in disarray. Broken glass crunched underfoot, and heavy curtains had been torn from their rods. Two of Robb's men stood on either side of a door that presumably led to Cersei's bedchamber. At Robb's nod, they stepped aside. One guard whispered, "She's been quiet for hours now. Hardly ate a thing we brought. Tea her." Robb pushed the door open, Jon at his side. The chamber smelled stale, curtains drawn tight. The once luxurious furnishings looked drab in the dim gloom. Cersei sat by a window, a battered goblet in her hand. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her eyes were red-rimmed from tears or lack of sleep. She stared out at nothing. Grey Wind and Ghost, who had followed at a discreet distance, hovered in the doorway, neither daring to approach the woman whose child they had killed. Cersei slowly turned her head, her gaze alighting on Robb first, then Jon. A faint twist of her lips suggested contempt, though her face was otherwise hollow. "So," she said, her voice a ragged whisper, "have you come to gloat? To watch me weep for my son?" Jon remained silent, but Robb shook his head. "I take no joy in Joffrey's death. Too many have died already." She huffed a bitter laugh, swirling the wine in her goblet. "Spare me your false pity. I loved my children, each one of them. And you killed the last shred of that love last night." Robb felt a stirring of anger at her accusations. "Did you love Sansa, too, when you let Joffrey torment her? When you allowed him to kill my father?" Cersei's eyes flared. "I did what I had to do to protect my family. I was taught that the world would devour the weak. There was no place for mercy under the Lannister lion." Jon's voice was low but sharp. "And now look at where it's left you." She glared at him, lips parted in a snarl. "I know who you are. Ned Stark's bastard, the deserter from the Night's Watch. You're lucky the law isn't applied as it should be, or you'd be swinging from the gallows." Her bitterness radiated from every syllable. Robb drew a breath. "You've lost. But that doesn't mean you must die. If you cooperate, if you stand trial without scheming to burn the city or murder innocents, you'll have a chance at life. Though your actions will be judged in full. I offer you no illusions." Cersei let out a rattling exhale, and for a moment, she looked older than her years. "You think I care for my own life now? My father is gone, my sons are gone, and my daughter is betrothed to some Dornish princeling. What do I have left?" Robb had no easy answer. He recalled his father's lessons about duty and justice, but had never felt the weight of them quite like now. "That is for you to decide. There will be a formal hearing, and I cannot guarantee mercy. But I prefer not to spill more blood if it can be avoided." She fixed him with a long, unreadable look, then turned her head away. "Leave me be, Wolf. There's no comfort you can offer." Robb lingered a moment, then stepped back, giving Jon a look of finality. They left her to her solitude, instructing the guards to keep watch but treat her humanely. The door closed, sealing her in that dim chamber. Robb couldn't rid himself of the uneasy feeling that she might attempt something reckless if pushed too far. But for now, they had more pressing matters than a mother's desperate wrath. They continued their rounds, visiting the many corners of the Red Keep that had once teemed with Lannister loyalists. The kitchens were staffed with frightened servants who flinched at the sight of dire wolves and wildling warriors. Robb instructed them to remain at their posts, promising no harm if they followed the new rules. The library, once used by the royal family and their advisors, lay in a state of disarray, as if some had sought to hide or destroy incriminating documents. Even the king's private council chambers showed signs of hasty abandonment. By afternoon, Robb was forced to address a gathering of city officials in the Great Hall, a space of wide stone floors and tall windows that caught the dull winter daylight. These officials, harbor masters, guild leaders, minor nobles, scuttled in, looking anxiously for signs of the new regime's intentions. Robb stood on a raised step, not the dais of the Iron Throne, but to one side of it, refusing to claim that seat. The Stark banner draped behind him, its gray direwolf a stark contrast to the usual Baratheon and Lannister standards that had dominated the city for so long. Jon and a handful of other northern lords flanked him. He spoke plainly. "You've all seen what war has done to your city. I won't lie to you, more challenges await. Winter is coming, and with it the threat of the White Walkers. We must prepare. Your city needs leadership, not cruelty. My father taught me that loyalty is won by fairness, by respect, not by fear alone. If you work with us, you will find that House Stark rewards honesty and diligence." His words were met with murmurs of uncertainty. Some of these men might have grown wealthy under Lannister patronage, or perhaps they had prospered by exploiting the small folk. Now they had to decide whether to accept the Wolf King's rule or attempt to undermine it. He read the tension in their faces and knew it would take time. Time he might not have. A man in fine yet dusty robes cleared his throat. "Your Grace, if that is what we are to call you, what do you intend for the city's governance? Do we continue as before, or will there be changes?" Robb inclined his head to Jon. Jon stepped forward, addressing the crowd in a measured tone. We cannot maintain the old structures as they were. The gold cloaks need new officers, men who won't ignore corruption or brutality. The distribution of food must be centralized to avoid hoarding. And we'll need crafters, smiths, builders, all to prepare for the winter. King's Landing may stand as a bastion if the war in the north goes ill. The safety of the city and the realm depends on cooperation. Another official, somewhat bolder, raised a hand. But if the Tyrells choose to stand against you, who will supply us? Much of our grain comes from the Reach. And what of the Vale or Dorne? Robb's voice carried firm resolve. I plan to negotiate with each region. The War of the Five Kings has torn Westeros apart. I would see it ended. I don't claim to be your rightful king by birth, but King's Landing must not be left to ruin. If the Tyrells want peace, we'll grant it. If they offer us violence, we'll meet it. The crowd exchanged uneasy looks, but there were no open protests. They recognized they had little choice but to bide their time and hope the new regime was less brutal than the last. Robb dismissed them with orders to present a complete accounting of the city's stockpiles and treasury. The officials shuffled out. One or two gave shallow bows of respect, though fear lingered in their eyes. As the hall cleared, Jon placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. We might find allies among them if we show fairness. But I sense they're too frightened to commit to anything yet. Robb nodded, noticing that sweat beaded along his temples despite the cool air. The pressure of leadership bore down on him with crushing weight. It's all precarious. We need something that can unite the realm quickly. You told me the truth about the dead. If half of what you've described is accurate, every living man, woman, and child should be arming themselves. But they remain focused on power struggles. Jon's dark eyes flicked toward the main doors as though seeing beyond them. They haven't stood on the wall to watch an army of whites. They haven't seen the Night King or the devastation at Har Home. Words won't move them. They'll need proof or an overwhelming reason to fear. Robb thought of the egg again. A live dragon could be that reason. And yet he shuddered at the notion of harnessing such destructive power. Would it truly answer to a Stark? Legend said Targaryens alone had the blood of old Valyria. But even if the egg responded to the warmth in Winterfell's crypts, that didn't guarantee loyalty or safety. The fiery wings of a dragon could just as easily devour the north as protect it. Robb only knew that if the egg did hatch, they would have to proceed with absolute caution. Late in the afternoon, word arrived from the party Robb had sent to treat with the Tyrells. It bore troubling news. Margaery and her father, Mace Tyrell, had barricaded themselves with a modest guard, refusing to allow the Northmen inside. She demanded safe passage to the Red Keep to negotiate in person, claiming that if they forced her to yield, it would be seen as a violation of guest right. Reluctantly, Robb agreed, sending back a message that guaranteed their safety under his personal protection. He assigned a small escort of northern men to bring them to the keep. If the Tyrells had any cunning, they would not attempt foul play so soon, especially given the array of forces in the city. Nevertheless, caution was paramount. By the time the Tyrell entourage arrived, Margaery and her father, accompanied by a handful of Reach Knights, torches lit the courtyard. The sun had sunk behind the city walls, painting the sky with a riot of gold and crimson. Robb stood at the main gate of the Red Keep, flanked by a mix of northern soldiers and wildlings as well as Jon. The clop of horses on stone heralded the approach of Margaery's party. She sat atop a pale mare, cloak trimmed in lush green velvet. Her face was composed, regal even, but Robb saw tension in the set of her jaw. Mace Tyrell rode beside her, looking round-faced and uncertain, his extravagant garb speckled with dust from the roads. The knights wore house colors, gold roses on green fields. Margaery halted a safe distance away, scanning the array of northern arms. She caught sight of the dire wolves and inhaled sharply. The tales of the savage beasts that fought alongside the king in the north had reached every corner of Westeros. Yet she did not flinch. Instead, she turned her gaze to Robb, calm and appraising. "Your Grace," she said softly. "I come in peace on behalf of House Tyrell." Robb bowed his head in a polite but guarded gesture. "Lady Margaery, Lord Mace, I welcome you. My men will show you to the hall where we might speak. You have my word you will not be harmed as guests under the Stark roof." Margaery met his eyes with a steady calm. "We accept your hospitality." She dismounted, assisted by a Tyrell knight. Her father followed, muttering something under his breath about the smells of the city. The group entered under guard, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Robb led them across the courtyard where flickering torches cast elongated shadows on the walls. Inside the keep, he guided them to a smaller audience chamber rather than the throne room. The space was less intimidating, more intimate. He had no wish to replicate the Lannister intimidation theatrics. A long table stood at the center, with carved chairs around it. Servants brought wine and bread, placing them with trembling efficiency. Ghost and Grey Wind lurked near the door, watchful. Jon stood beside Robb, while Margaery and her father claimed seats opposite them. Once pleasantries were exchanged, Mace Tyrell wasted little time. "What is the meaning of this, Stark? The city's in chaos, the Boy King is dead. House Tyrell has invested a great deal in this alliance with the crown. Now you come and append it all? Where does that leave us?" Robb's voice was even, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "The crown you speak of was built on lies. Joffrey was no true ally to the realm. He killed my father, tormented the people, and did nothing to maintain peace. He's dead now, and the city surrenders to the north. I'm here to stop the bloodshed and unify Westeros against a threat far greater than you can imagine." Margaery leaned forward slightly. "You refer to the tales from the wall?" Jon stepped in. "Tales, but true ones. The dead are walking. White Walkers have returned. An army of whites grows with every life they take. If we remain divided, Westeros will fall." Mace scoffed, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Such stories are older than the Undulls. Dark shapes on the horizon. We've heard them for generations, and they've never materialized." Jon's hand closed into a fist. "They have materialized now. Ask any brother of the Night's Watch or any wildling who followed Mance Rayder. Winter is coming in earnest, bringing horrors your southern songs never described." Margaery observed Jon keenly, then looked at Robb. "Even if I take your words as truth, how do you propose we unify the realm? The Lannisters won't simply vanish, and the other houses will not kneel just because you say there's a threat in the north." Robb rested his palms on the table. "We need alliances. Food from the Reach, ships from the Iron Islands, if they can be negotiated with. The Vale, the Stormlands, and Dorne, all must be brought into the fold. We can negotiate claims and titles after the threat is dealt with. If House Tyrell stands with us, we can more quickly restore order in King's Landing, ensuring food for the small folk. Show them that House Tyrell is still the provider, and you'll earn their gratitude. Meanwhile, I focus on forging alliances in other corners of the realm. If we fail, we all die anyway." Margaery's eyes flicked to her father, who looked deeply conflicted. "We had hoped to seat me as Joffrey's queen, forging a Tyrell future on the Iron Throne," she admitted. "Now that future is gone. We face a crossroads." Mace cleared his throat. "With Joffrey dead, Tommen might be the next in line, or Myrcella in Dorne. Do you plan to enthrone yourself, Stark?" Robb's gaze drifted. "I haven't decided. We have the city, but I didn't come here for a crown. The war forced my hand. For now, I serve as the ruler of King's Landing by right of conquest and necessity. If the realm unites behind another, someone worthy, I may step aside, provided we stand strong against the Walkers. The North will not bow lightly, but I also see the need for unity." A taut silence followed. Margaery tapped a slender finger on the table, as if measuring every possibility in her mind. At last, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "For the Tyrells to accept this, we need assurances. The Reach cannot feed a city in turmoil with no promise of restitution. We must be recognized as protectors of the South. Our lands must remain secure, our rights respected. And we must retain a voice in whatever new order emerges." Jon nodded. "You'll have that voice, Lady Margaery. We have no desire to strip power from the Tyrells. On the contrary, your support could be a cornerstone of what comes next." Mace Tyrell mulled it over, tugging at his ample doublet. "And what of House Lannister's debts to us? The wedding costs, the loans, the gifts we've provided." His mouth twisted at the memory of wasted gold. Robb resisted the urge to scoff. "The Lannister coffers are all but empty. Whatever illusions of wealth they maintained are largely gone. You can fight over scraps or join us in forging a new compact. That's the choice." Margaery's dark eyes flashed with a trace of cunning. "I propose a vow. The Tyrells will assist in feeding the city and ensure a measure of stability, but we will not commit troops to fight the other houses unless we are threatened or unless it is part of a larger war effort against these White Walkers. In exchange, you affirm our claim to Highgarden and the dominion of the Reach, and you maintain your stance that we are part of this new alliance, equal partners, not subordinates. Robb could sense the balancing act in her words. She wanted to keep her family's power intact, to avoid undue risk in the wars that might come. But securing the Tyrell's help to feed the city was critical. Without food, King's Landing would starve, and an uprising would follow. A part of him longed to push for more, to demand Tyrell troops for the cause, but he understood that if he asked too much, Margaery and her father might flee the city or even sabotage his rule. Better to secure a partial alliance now than force a full confrontation. Jon glanced at Robb, then gave a slight nod. Robb matched Margaery's gaze. Done. We will memorialize it in writing by day's end. Together, we keep King's Landing from collapse. Meanwhile, I'll send ravens to the other great houses, urging them to meet in a grand council once the city is stable. Margaery pressed her lips into a faint smile. A wise move. Let us set quill to parchment. Thus began the forging of an uneasy alliance. Robb and Jon recognized that Mace Tyrell's grudging cooperation was less important than Margaery's quiet determination. She seemed keenly aware that the old order was dead, and a new one must be shaped by alliances rather than blind loyalties. So they composed a formal agreement in the presence of scribes, sealed it with wax, and the Tyrells departed under the promise that caravans of Reach grain would soon enter the city. Margaery lingered a moment before leaving. She addressed Jon softly. I've heard rumors of a dragon in the north, a rumor that a Targaryen relic rests in Winterfell. Is that true? Jon's expression froze. Robb looked away sharply, hiding the flicker of alarm in his eyes. The rumor must have spread faster than expected. Rumors, Jon finally said, his tone carefully neutral, are seldom accurate. We found some relics beneath the castle, yes. But old bones and stone do not make a dragon. Margaery smiled with the poise of someone unaccustomed to being denied. Then let them remain old bones. Still, if the day ever comes when the North wields dragonfire, I hope you'll remember our alliance. She turned and left, her green cloak trailing behind. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the corridor. Robb exhaled slowly, feeling as though he had just sidestepped a pit of vipers. Jon's eyes were dark with concern. The rumor is out, he muttered. It will only grow. We'll deal with it when we must, Robb replied. For now, we have a city to hold. The next days brought a semblance of order. True to her word, Margaery ensured that shipments of grain, fruit, and salted meats began to arrive from the Reach. Robb's men worked alongside Tyrell agents to distribute rations, quell small riots, and maintain a presence on the streets. The Gold Cloaks were reorganized under the watchful eyes of loyal Northmen, with new captains assigned who would swear allegiance to House Stark, at least in the short term. Jon roamed the city tirelessly, breaking up tavern brawls, chasing down Lannister men rumored to be plotting sabotage, and ensuring the wildlings didn't run amok. He realized that leading a city was even more complicated than leading a fort or an army. Each evening, Robb met with his lords in the Red Keep's council chambers to discuss the next steps. Letters were sent to the Vale, to Dorne, to the Stormlands, and to what was left of the Baratheon and Tully loyalists scattered across the war-torn land. The messages spoke of the White Walker threat and urged a grand summit in King's Landing. Not all would respond, of course, some might laugh or ignore the warnings. But if enough houses joined them, perhaps they could present a united front when the darkness finally marched south. At last, nearly a fortnight after the city fell, Jon approached Robb with an urgent request. They stood in the courtyard, where the air had grown colder each day. Horses stomped in the gloom. Torches sputtered in the wind. I have to go north, Jon said, voice resolute. The egg is unguarded save for a small garrison. Winterfell needs me. There's also the matter of the Night's Watch. Even if I can't officially command them, I might be able to sway more of the Watch to our cause. There are good men at Castle Black who know the threat is real. Robb felt the pull of family ties and the weight of responsibilities yet to come. You've done enough here to help me secure the city, but I won't deny that I feel stronger with you. At my side. Still, I agree, the North must not be left unattended. The White Walkers won't wait. Jon placed a hand on Robb's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood. You've got the city, the Tyrell alliance, and enough men to keep the peace. More will come if the lords heed your summons. But we can't neglect Winterfell. So I'll take a portion of wildlings, those who are willing to return. Tormund included, if he'll come, and maybe a handful of your knights if you can spare them. With that force, I'll ensure the north is prepared. We'll stockpile dragon glass, fortify the wall if we can. And keep watch on the egg. Robb nodded, remembering the subtle pulse of heat he had felt beneath his palm. Agreed. This place is no home to you. I can sense it. Your place is in the north. Just send word when you can. Let me know if the egg changes. Jon gave a faint, rare smile. I will. And you, try not to let the city devour you. Remember, we fight for something bigger than the Iron Throne. They shared a tight embrace, mindful that men watched from all sides. A king and his half-brother, forging a bond that had been tested by war and destiny alike. The next morning, as dawn struggled against a bleak sky, Jon departed with Tormund and a column of free folk, plus 50 northern riders volunteering to protect the roads against bandits and stragglers. Ghost padded at Jon's side, while Grey Wind lingered with Robb. They passed through the city gates, the echo of hooves fading into the distance. The small folk watched them leave with uneasy curiosity, uncertain whether the giant, bearded wildlings were friends or foes. Either way, they vanished up the King's Road, setting their course for Winterfell. Robb stood on the ramparts, Grey Wind by his side, as Jon's company dwindled into the horizon. He could feel the weight of the city pressing on him, this fortress of stone and secrets. King's Landing was his to rule, at least for now. But every fiber of him longed for the crisp air of the north, the quiet hush of falling snow, the smell of pine on the wind. Down in the yard, Caitlin oversaw a new batch of arrivals, some from the Riverlands, some from the Crownlands. They had come to bend the knee or to ask for protection. War had left them battered, and the name Stark still held a whisper of honor that offered hope. He turned, scanning the city. Smoke no longer choked the skyline as it had the day of the battle. The main gates were patrolled by Tyrell and Stark men, side by side. Flea Bottom still simmered with tension, but the worst of the riots had subsided. Word spread that the Wolf King was not as cruel as the Lannisters, that he had no taste for wanton slaughter. The small folk, impoverished and tired of endless conflict, began to trust that they might at least find bread in the days to come. As the days stretched into weeks, ravens returned from across Westeros. The Vale's response was guarded, penned by Peter Baelish himself, who claimed that young Lord Robert Arryn was ill, thus preventing him from attending any Grand Council. The letter was full of sly compliments and carefully veiled threats, making Robb's blood boil. Dorne, through Prince Doran Martell, responded with a polite but noncommittal reply, stating they would consider sending an envoy if certain conditions were met, chief among them justice for the crimes committed against Elia Martell and her children. Robb had no immediate answer to that, given that the chief culprit, Gregor Clegane, was already dead. As for Stannis Baratheon, rumor placed him still in Dragonstone, nursing a bitter, puritanical sense of his own legitimacy. No direct response came from him. The Stormlands, many of which had declared for Stannis or been ravaged by war, remained silent. Amid these uncertain tidings, a single bright note arrived in the form of a raven from Riverrun. Edmure Tully had successfully reclaimed much of the Riverlands from scattered Lannister forces thanks to the fracturing of the Lannisters' hold. With that, the Tully banners rose once more. Riverrun was secure, and Brynden Tully, who was now in King's Landing, took that news with a rare smile. The war that had begun so long ago with Ned Stark's execution was nearing some resolution in the Riverlands at least. But none of it truly mattered if the White Walkers poured over the wall. Reports trickled in from the far north, from Castle Black and Eastwatch, each one more grim than the last. It seemed that the undead were growing bolder, venturing closer to the wall. Some nights, watchers on the battlements heard eerie howls echoing across the ice. If the rumors were true, the walkers now had giant wights, undead bears, and who knew what other nightmares in their ranks. Robb's nights turned sleepless. He roamed the Red Keep in the small hours, accompanied by Grey Wind, who padded silently through the corridors. Guards saluted, half asleep themselves. In those lonely walks, Robb remembered Winterfell's crypts with a kind of desperate longing. He had never asked for the burden of the entire realm's future, yet it had fallen to him all the same. If the realm was to unite, it needed a rallying point, a leader they could trust and fear if necessary. For many, that would only come if they believed House Stark could wield a power akin to the Targaryen dragons of old. One night, he stood on a balcony that overlooked the city, the moonlight glimmering on the black waters of the bay. The winds off the sea carried a sharp chill. He found himself wondering if, at that very moment, the egg beneath Winterfell was stirring, cracking perhaps. The image filled him with dread and a strange flicker of hope. A dragon could devastate armies, but it might also be the one force that could stand against an endless horde of wights, the embodiment of fire against ice. Time in King's Landing became a study in strained compromise. The Tyrells gained increasing influence over the distribution of food, winning favor among the small folk. Marjorie Tyrell, in particular, acted with charitable flair, handing out loaves of bread and containers of porridge to the hungry. Her name spread in whispered gratitude, and soon, some corners of the city hailed her as the Rose of Mercy. Robb didn't begrudge her the credit. The city was calmer for her efforts, and for now that was what mattered. Yet he never forgot that the Tyrells were not merely altruists. They were canny players in the great game, amassing goodwill to strengthen their own position. Cersei remained confined to her chambers, carefully watched. A few times she demanded to see Robb, but he refused, sending quiet word that her trial would come when the realm was more settled. Word reached him that she had destroyed several precious ornaments out of rage and threatened to take her own life. He had his guards remove anything sharp or dangerous from her rooms, mindful of the example it would set if the last Lannister queen ended herself. Rumors persisted that she was sinking into a deep mania, fueled by grief and humiliation. Sansa Stark's name hovered at the edges of conversation. Some claimed she had fled the city even before Joffrey's death. Others believed she had been spirited away by Littlefinger. If she was still within the capital's walls, she left no trace. Robb dispatched searchers, but they found no sign of her. He prayed she was safe wherever she might be, if only the gods would grant that mercy. Amidst all this turmoil, a raven finally arrived from Castle Black. It was addressed to Jon Snow, but since Jon had already departed, Robb opened it. The news it carried made his blood run cold. The message was brief and grim. Ser Alliser Thorne commands the watch now. Wildling skirmishes to the west. Unconfirmed sightings of the White Walkers, more frequent every moon. The cold intensifies. Send any help you can. Maester Aemon. Robb read it twice in the flicker of candlelight. Ser Alliser Thorne was a man known for his hatred of Jon. If he commanded, that meant whatever fraction of the watch remained loyal to Jon's memory was likely marginalized. He dreaded what that might mean for Jon's attempt to rally them. The mention of unconfirmed sightings of the White Walkers brought home the reality of the approaching doom. Every day spent politicking in King's Landing was a day the dead advanced. He paced, hands clenched. The city was too vast, too complicated to abandon. He still had lords to sway, a trial to arrange, and thousands of refugees to manage. The Tyrell grain would keep them alive through the winter for a time, but not forever. And the White Walkers would not knock politely at the door. Was there a way to bring all the great houses to the city before it was too late? Or should Robb leave a steward in charge and return north? That tug-of-war battered him with each sunrise. The next morning, he stood before the Iron Throne, gazing at it in quiet contempt. A beast of twisted metal, hammered from the swords of enemies. It represented everything he had grown to loathe about Southern power. Yet, ironically, it might be the only symbol strong enough to unite the realm. Gray wind sniffed the dais, unsettled. Robb placed a hand on the throne's rough edges, careful not to cut himself. A new wave of resolve washed over him. If the realm needed a king in truth, one who could drive them to stand against the White Walkers, then perhaps he would have to be that king, at least for a while. As he contemplated that decision, a messenger burst in, breathless. "Your Grace, men from the Vale ride at the gates. They say Peter Baelish has returned. He demands audience. He brings a young woman with him." Robb straightened, dread and hope swirling within him. A young woman? Did they say her name? The messenger fidgeted. They claim it's Sansa Stark, Your Grace. But I saw her from the walls. She wears her hair colored dark and seems afraid. Robb's heart thundered in his chest. Sansa, his sister, had she truly been in Peter Baelish's clutches all this time? The very man who had betrayed his father so long ago, who had set so many wheels of mischief in motion. The thought of seeing Sansa again, potentially rescuing her from whatever designs Baelish had, filled Robb with fierce urgency. But he knew Baelish was as cunning as they came. He never moved without a scheme. If he was bringing Sansa, it meant he expected something in return. Robb beckoned to his guards. "Open the gates. Let them approach. Bring them to the throne room under heavy guard. And summon my lords, Tyrell, Tully, and the others." The messenger bowed and fled. Robb felt his mouth go dry, the possibility of reuniting with his sister overshadowed by the knowledge that Baelish seldom acted from kindness. Grey Wind paced around Robb, sensing his agitation. This new development threatened to rearrange the fragile order Robb had constructed. But he would not turn his back on his sister, if it truly was Sansa. He had to see her, protect her, no matter the cost. In a flurry of activity, men hurried to the gates. Within the half-hour, the throne room began to fill. The Tyrell knights took up position on one side, while northern soldiers formed ranks on the other. Murmurs spread among them. Marjorie appeared, curious and attentive, flanked by a pair of reach lords. Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, quietly slipped in as well. Robb paced near the dais, refusing to sit on the Iron Throne. Grey Wind prowled just behind him, ears pricked. At last, the heavy doors were pushed open. Petyr Baelish entered, smirking with careful composure. He wore elegant, subdued finery, a mocking half-bow that served as greeting. Beside him stood a young woman cloaked in a dark mantle. Her hair was indeed dyed a near-ebony shade, but Robb recognized her face at once, older, more sorrowful, but undeniably his sister. Sansa's eyes flickered as they landed on Robb, and something in her expression trembled. She pressed her lips together as though holding back tears. Baelish walked forward, a light click of heels on the marble floor. "Your Grace," he said with unctuous politeness, "you look well. My compliments on your retaking of King's Landing. I bring with me a gift of sorts. I believe you know my companion, though she has traveled under the name Elaine Stone for some time." Robb's blood boiled. He stepped down from the dais, ignoring the hush that fell. He stared at his sister, searching her face. Sansa. The name felt brittle, weighted by everything that had happened. She let out a small sob, took a step toward him. "Robb, I thought you were," but her voice shook and tears glistened in her eyes. In 2 strides, Robb closed the distance and enveloped her in a fierce embrace. She trembled in his arms, her slim frame quaking with pent-up sorrow. He held her tightly, ignoring the stares of courtiers and guards alike. For a moment, he was not king in the north or conqueror of King's Landing. He was just a brother who had thought he might never see his sister again. Sansa clung to him as if he might vanish. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I tried to, there was no way to." She broke off, voice halting as tears overtook her. Robb whispered comforting words, stroking her hair, urging her that she was safe now. When at last she composed herself enough to stand straight, her cheeks wet, Robb turned a cold glare upon Petyr Baelish. "I have many questions for you. But for now, I'll thank you for returning my sister safely." Baelish's thin smile never wavered. "Family is so important, wouldn't you agree? Sansa can explain the circumstances of our flight from the city after Joffrey, well, after certain events. She's quite fortunate to have me as a benefactor." Robb clenched his jaw. "You will answer to me for your role in my father's death and your manipulations of my family. Don't think I've forgotten." Baelish spread his hands, adopting a hurt expression. "I assure you, Ned Stark was a friend. I grieved his loss. Mistakes were made, alliances misunderstood. My only aim now is to see justice served. And so I offer my resources, my cunning, to help you, your grace." A few watchers snorted softly at the blatant hypocrisy. Robb almost laughed, but the feeling in his chest was closer to pure anger. "Justice," he echoed. "You speak of justice as if you haven't twisted the realm around your little finger. You're here for personal gain, not justice." Sansa stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Robb's arm. "He saved me from the Lannisters' clutches, took me to the Vale. But I was not free. He planned to wed me to. I don't know. There were so many schemes. But when we heard rumors that you had taken King's Landing, Petyr decided it might be time to bring me here." Her words spilled out in a rush, as though each confession cost her. Robb's fury toward Baelish mounted. He forced himself to remain calm, aware that half the lords of the city were observing this reunion. He could not simply strike Baelish down without cause, though the idea tempted him sorely. Instead, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "You bring Sansa back now, and you seek to ingratiate yourself to House Stark. I should have you imprisoned. But Sansa, your well-being is my first concern." He turned to his sister. "Do you need healing, rest? I'll have you taken to suitable chambers with my mother's ladies to tend you." She nodded, her face wan, relief etched into her features. "Yes, please." He beckoned a pair of northern guards. Escort Lady Sansa to the upper apartments. Send for the maids, tell them to bring fresh clothing, food, and anything else she requires. The guards moved to comply, and Sansa looked once more at Robb, a flicker of a smile amid her tears. She squeezed his hand, then allowed them to lead her away. For a moment, Robb watched after her, the burden of relief mingling with the knowledge of how battered her spirit must be. That left Baelish alone, standing with careful composure as the lords and knights stared. The tension was thick as a drawn bowstring. Robb turned to him, voice cold enough to freeze steel. As for you, I will deal with you after I speak to my sister more thoroughly. Until then, you are my guest in King's Landing. Guards, see him to chambers. He is not to leave them without permission. Baelish bowed theatrically, as if not the least offended. Of course, your grace. I am happy to cooperate in any way. I suggest we speak soon, though, for I have a great deal of insight into the current complexities of the realm. Robb nodded sharply, unable to hide his loathing. Baelish was led out by armed men, and the throne room emptied, courtiers retreating to spread new gossip. The great John slapped Robb on the back, congratulating him on the safe return of his sister. Marjorie offered polite relief, though her expression was unreadable as she watched Peter Baelish depart. She, too, knew the cunning of that man. Alone for a moment by the dais, Robb closed his eyes. Sansa was safe. In the swirl of wars and alliances, that single fact provided a glimmer of warmth. Yet Baelish's arrival complicated everything. The man was more dangerous than a viper in the grass. His influence in the Vale might be crucial if Robb wanted to draw the Eyrie into this alliance, but trusting Baelish was akin to entrusting a lamb to a wolf. Better to keep him close, watch his every move. Even as relief coursed through him, Robb sensed the unstoppable tide of events continuing on. The White Walkers stirred in the far north. The lines of power in King's Landing shifted like sand underfoot. And somewhere beneath Winterfell, a dragon egg awaited its moment, perhaps to birth a new flame in the heart of winter. He prayed Jon had reached Winterfell safely, that the egg remained secure, and that no new calamity had befallen the land they both called home. Yet in King's Landing, so far from the snows, he felt trapped in the Game of Thrones more firmly than ever. He refused to let it consume him as it had so many. The memory of Ned Stark's steadfast honor guided him like a distant star. He would secure the city for as long as necessary, forging alliances, punishing betrayers, protecting the realm from within. Then, when the time came, he would return to the north, bringing with him every ally he could muster, to stand against the long, cold night that crept closer each day. More weeks passed, slipping like grains of sand through the hourglass. Sansa recovered slowly, each day emerging a little more from the shell of fear that Baelish's manipulations had wrought. She spent hours speaking with her mother, Caitlin, behind closed doors, no doubt recounting the horrors she'd endured since leaving Winterfell. Caitlin's eyes were red when she emerged from those visits, but she straightened her spine each time someone approached, determined not to show vulnerability. Sansa avoided the public spaces of the Red Keep, preferring the relative quiet of her rooms. Robb did not press her to appear publicly until she felt ready. Peter Baelish bided his time in his assigned quarters, which were comfortable enough but constantly watched by northern guards. He wrote letters claiming they were for the Vale. He sought audiences with Robb, offering counsel on how to handle the Vale Lords, how to manage the city's finances. Robb granted him a few short meetings, carefully guarded. Each time, Baelish spoke with silky confidence, never once acknowledging blame for Ned Stark's downfall. He weaved complicated tapestries of half-truths, enticing the new regime with possibilities of controlling the Vale's knights or gleaning wealth from certain trade alliances. Robb listened but remained wary, telling him that until Sansa's accusations were fully heard, he would not release him from a guarded status. In these days, the lineage of power gradually took shape. The Tyrells, entrenched in the city's supply, commanded loyalty among merchants. The Northmen, through martial presence, enforced order. The small folk remained on edge, but as no new outrages occurred, many began to grudgingly accept the Wolf King. Robb's challenge was to ensure that acceptance did not erode the moment the next crisis hit. He tried to be fair, opening small courts each morning to hear grievances, meting out judgments with the measured calm Ned once possessed. Grey wind often lay near his feet, a silent symbol of Stark power. Petitioners treated the dire wolf with fearful respect, especially after hearing stories of how it had dispatched Joffrey Baratheon. Still, the knights brought no solace. Each raven from the north spoke of a deepening cold, more sightings of whites, more tension at the wall. Jon's replies, when they arrived, were terse, describing a precarious situation. Tormund's wildlings had entered the gift, some even occupying abandoned holdfasts. The small garrison at Winterfell was holding firm, patrolling the crypts. The egg remained in the darkness, its warmth consistent. No sign of hatching yet, though Jon confessed that he felt it radiating power more strongly than before. That alone made Robb's stomach twist with uneasy anticipation. He sometimes dreamed of a dragon erupting from beneath Winterfell, black and red scales shimmering as it soared into the snowy sky. Finally, as the end of the year approached, a messenger from the Night's Watch arrived at the city gates in the middle of the night, half-frozen and wild-eyed. He demanded to see the king in the north. Robb, roused from a restless sleep, met the man in a smaller audience chamber. The messenger was a rangy ranger wearing the black cloak of the watch, his cheeks windburned, eyes haunted. "My lord, your grace," he began, voice cracking. "I come from Eastwatch by the sea. The dead are moving along the coast. Fishing villages found empty. The watch is stretched thin. We fear that once the ice thickens, they'll cross the Bay of Seals. We're calling all realms for aid. But few answer." Robb's heart hammered. "Did you see Jon Snow? Is he still in Winterfell?" The ranger swallowed hard, nodding. "Last we heard, Lord Snow, begging your pardon, but that's what they call him, was moving between Winterfell and Castle Black, gathering men, supplies. He fights a losing battle, your grace. The cold is savage. We fear the wall might not be enough." A hush fell. Gray wind growled low, sensing his master's distress. Robb closed his eyes, grappling with the truth. The White Walkers were on the move. Every day spent forging alliances in King's Landing was time the undead could use to amass. He recalled Jon's plea, the countless warnings in the Raven's letters. A choice loomed, inevitable and stark. Remain in King's Landing, or rally the realm in the north. But the realm was not yet rallied. If he marched north now, he might face the threat alone, with only the north and the wildlings. The south would be fractured, open to opportunists. Yet if he waited too long, the wall might fall. He dismissed the ranger to rest and recover, sending for hot soup and blankets. Then he stood by the window, gazing at the glittering lights of the city. Each lamp and torch in the night was a life, a soul that had no idea how close doom lurked. He felt the weight of their fates pressing upon him. Outside, the moon was high, pale as bone, cast the city in silver and shadow. In the days that followed, he convened a war council of sorts. The Tyrells joined, as did the assembled northern lords, plus a smattering of Crownland's lords who had aligned themselves with the new regime. Brynden Tully was there, representing Riverrun. Sansa quietly sat at one end, not speaking much, but her presence a reminder of what the Starks had lost. Also in attendance was Petyr Baelish, under guard, permitted to observe but not allowed to roam free. Robb laid out the truth. "We have no more time for delays. The walkers are moving. If we do not stand against them at the wall, the north will fall and eventually all of Westeros." He paused, letting the gravity sink in. "I propose we gather an army here in King's Landing. The Tyrells, the Riverlords, any knights from the Vale who will come Dorne if they answer. Then we march north with all the strength we can muster, meet with Jon Snow's forces, and hold the wall at all costs." Margaery Tyrell raised her eyebrows. "That is a large undertaking. And if we empty the city of defenders, others might seize it in our absence, Stannis, for instance, or the Ironborn. Or even foreign sellswords." Robb nodded grimly. "True. So we leave a garrison enough to hold the walls. But the bulk of our combined might must go north. We can send envoys to Stannis, urging him to join us at the wall rather than remain at Dragonstone." Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. "And what do we gain, exactly, by facing these mythical wraiths from the ice? If they are real, we defend the realm. If they are not, we waste resources." Petyr Baelish interjected, voice as smooth as silk. "The realm is already in flux. A bold campaign to the wall could unite us, or it could break us. One might consider forging a more flexible approach. Perhaps we allow the north to fend for itself until the threat is proven." A ripple of unease ran around the table. Robb slammed a fist down, rattling goblets. "I won't abandon the north. House Stark swore to protect these lands, and I'll keep that vow. Let there be no doubt." He turned a steely gaze on Baelish. "If that means waging war against an enemy most of you have never seen, so be it. But know this, if the north falls, the dead will sweep south unstoppable. Your fine castles, your golden fields, your precious city will all be consumed. There will be no lords left to bicker over the spoils. Marjorie's face was pale, but she lifted her chin. If that is what we risk, then House Tyrell will march. I won't let this city starve or freeze. Though I pray you're wrong, King Robb. Robb inclined his head in gratitude. Thank you, Lady Marjorie. To the rest of you I say, gather your banners. We leave within weeks, as soon as spring caravans can be arranged, which, given the abnormal cold, might be challenging. We head north. If we cannot wait for spring, we march anyway. We can't afford to let the snows bury us. Time is short. The older lords exchanged anxious glances, but faced with the Wolf King's determination and the Tyrell's support, few dared to openly resist. Baelish murmured something about contacting the Vale. Brynden Tully promised that Riverrun's knights would join. A hush followed as each man contemplated the enormity of the campaign. An entire southern army, traveling hundreds of leagues into the teeth of winter, to fight creatures out of nightmare. It sounded mad, yet to Robb Stark, it was the only sane course left. Thus set in motion the greatest northern march in living memory. Ravens flew in all directions. Dorne was asked to send spears. The Vale was urged to muster knights. Even the Iron Islands were invited, though Robb doubted they would comply, given their hunger for raids. The city began to transform from a seat of uncertain rule to a staging ground. Smiths worked tirelessly on weapons and chainmail, forging arrowheads from normal steel, though Jon's messages had stressed that dragonglass was the true weakness of the White Walkers. Scouts were dispatched to locate any caches of obsidian that might exist in the south or to arrange shipments from Dragonstone, if Stannis could be convinced to share or join. The problem was time. Each day, the snows in the north crept further. Each day, the dead multiplied. Amid the preparations, Robb kept a close eye on Sansa, ensuring she recovered. She grew stronger, though nights still brought her nightmares of Joffrey and King's Landing's cruelty. She confided in him that Baelish had planned to use her claim on Winterfell to manipulate the Northern Lords, a plan undone by Robb's unexpected survival and victory. Robb held her hand and promised she would never again be a pawn in other schemes. Meanwhile, letters from Jon arrived sporadically. He wrote of supply lines along the King's Road, fortifications at Moat Cailin, and uneasy negotiations with the wildlings. His frustration leapt off the page. The Night's Watch was stubborn, divided, and many questioned Jon's presence. But Tormund's wildlings remained loyal to him, as did many of the northern bannermen who had stayed behind. The final lines of Jon's last letter haunted Robb. I feel it, a cold deeper than winter. They're coming. We see them in the trees sometimes, shapes of pale fire-blue eyes. We have so little time. Hurry, brother. Robb read those words late one evening, alone in his chambers. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Grey wind lay curled near the hearth, breathing steadily. Robb's breath caught in his throat. The dead were not only creeping, they were watching, waiting for the moment to strike in force. He thought again of the crypts beneath Winterfell, the hidden vault with the dragon egg. If that egg hatched, perhaps they would have a weapon to turn the tide. But would it hatch in time? Could any mortal man, even a Stark, truly control such a beast? He set the letter aside and stared into the flickering embers, seeing visions of white wastes, skeletal wights, and an onrushing army of ice. The hour was late. With a groan of fatigue, he leaned back, letting his thoughts wander to the plans in motion, the northern campaign, the alliances, the forging of new weapons. It would all converge on the wall where the fate of Westeros would be decided. He prayed that whatever awaited them, they would face it united and with enough strength to survive. In the darkness, Grey Wind raised his head, yellow eyes glinting as though sensing his master's turmoil. Robb reached out and scratched the direwolf's thick fur. It won't be long now, he murmured. We'll return to Winterfell, you and I. And together we'll stand with Jon. I swear it. The direwolf let out a low, comforting whine, and Robb allowed himself a faint, grim smile. For all the horror ahead, they had each other, brothers, sisters, loyal allies, and perhaps, in the depths of Winterfell, a sleeping power. The realm might be facing its darkest hour, but so long as House Stark endured, there was a chance for light yet. Outside, the city slumbered under star-filled skies, unaware that the greatest challenge of the age was brewing in the far north, where an otherworldly host gathered. Soon, an army of southern lords, Tyrell bannermen, Riverland knights, and stubborn northerners would converge upon the wall in what might be mankind's last stand. And perhaps, if the old gods willed it, the cold darkness would meet fire, whether from mortal steel and dragonglass, or from the ancient flames of a dragon reborn in the heart of winter. The die was cast, the game in motion. One way or another, the next march north would decide the fate of them all.